Welcome to Babblecom 5. This is episode 9 of season 2 of Babylon 5, The Coming of Shadows. This is our first look at Centauri Prime and possibly also Centauri warships. The Emperor is liaising with his Prime Minister over an off-world trip, which the Prime Minister is uncertain about given the Emperor's health, but the Prime Minister is told to stay put in case of a crisis. The Emperor even declines his wig for his journey, saying he will go amongst them as he is. Jakar is incensed by the prospect of his visiting Babylon 5, but as Sheridan points out, the Emperor has been giving concessions to the Narn, but Jakar highlights the sins of his family, including 100,000 dead Narns and the strip mining of his homeworld. Sheridan wants him to try and broker a deal, but he's clearly not up for it. Sheridan asks him not to do anything they'll both regret, but Jakar says it's too late for that. As the Emperor's rather chunky convoy travels, we see that Reefer is on board again, with a very carefully prepared speech he'd like Londo to deliver. He and his associates have arranged for predictions in the speech to happen by various means, suggesting the Emperor to be weak so that they are well positioned when he passes. Veer overhears all this plotting and is clearly uncomfortable. Nor is Londo entirely happy, as his name will be mud in the royal court when he makes the speech. For once, they have something in common. The Emperor comes on board in a swanky purple shuttle, launched by the largest ship in his fleet, with fighters running escort. He greets the command crew in full dress uniform on his arrival, and before his tours begins, speaks to Dr. Franklin about Kosh, asking what he's seen of him. The answer, of course, is not a lot, and the Emperor has seen even less of him, it seems. He says the Centauri have sent expeditions into Vorlon space, but none have ever returned. He has heard much about them, and is keen to see one. In Jakar's quarters, the first circle of the Kari, the ruling body of the Narn, have agreed a course of action proposed by Jakar. He is to turn assassin at the reception for maximum exposure, and expresses a strange sense of calm, knowing that his future path is now set in stone and clear. Sheridan exchanges some life stories with the Emperor in private in the rotunda. It is apparent that the Emperor is questioning his path in life, as it was laid out for him, rather than being his choice, so he is interested to understand how others have chosen their own paths and why. He gives the impression that in his final moments, he wants to make a difference, to break free. Garibaldi is giving orders to lock the Zocalo down, whilst the mysterious figure who entered the station earlier and was identified as a frequent visitor watches on. Jakar is recording his last testament, stating he is acting on his own, that Natoth was not involved, and asking for his remains to be sent back to his family on Narn. He seems utterly committed. The command staff are at the reception, discussing the fact that the Emperor is travelling with two veiled telepaths who are paired from birth with two others, and see and hear what each other see and hear, at whatever distance, so when he travels his movements are known on Centauri Prime, and he knows what the royal court is up to in his absence. To everyone's surprise, Jakar turns up, promising nothing, but saying he will listen to what the Emperor has to say. Sheridan believes the speech will be important. Garibaldi is walking the Emperor's route, followed by the mysterious stranger, who finds himself on the wrong end of Garibaldi's PPG. He wants to talk to Garibaldi but falls silent when other security guards approach, who take him to holding. The Emperor is en route, and we see Jakar checking his gauntlet for his knife. He sees Delenn looking at him and moves before she can speak to him. Back on the main corridor, the Emperor's group pauses as he holds his chest and then crumples to the ground. Franklin responds to his link and races from the reception. On Centauri Prime, the other telepaths alert the Prime Minister in the throne room. Franklin tells the Emperor he wished he'd known of his condition earlier. His government wants him back on his warship, but Franklin says moving him could kill him. The Emperor says there are more important things than where he dies, and asks Franklin to pass on a message, one that he knows would not be passed on if he asked one of his own people to do so. In Londo's quarters, Reefer knows that rival factions on Centauri Prime are moving, having heard the news, and says they have to do something to rise above them before the Emperor passes. Veer watches on as Londo notes there is a Narn colony in Quadrant 14 on the edge of the Centauri space. Reefer laughs, saying it's a listening post. It would require a full assault force to take it back. Londo says he will take care of it, to Veer's dismay. Londo asks Reefer to send an expeditionary force in, even if it's just a few ships. Reefer will make arrangements. Veer really comes out of his shell, vehemently pleading with Londo not to go to Morden. He finally acquiesces to finding him and bringing him back, but says to Londo there'll be no turning back after this. Londo says he knows what his actions will result in: war with the Narn. G'Kar is cursing the Emperor's timing in his quarters. He has to take a moment to compose himself when Franklin arrives. Franklin explains that the Emperor wanted him to pass on a message, a very simple message, that he was sorry for everything that his family had done to the Narn. He wanted to say that standing next to a Narn in neutral territory, because he recognised that until someone apologised, there was no hope for peace. G'Kar said he had no idea and appears genuinely stunned. Franklin believes that to be the greatest tragedy of all. In his quarters, Londo is dozing and dreams. It's his death dream. He sees a hand reaching out of a sun, shadow vessels screeching over his head in bright sunshine, then an older version of himself, being crowned as Emperor, then coughing, alone, then being strangled by a one-eyed, older G'Kar. His cup drops to the floor and he awakens in reality. He clutches a clock, desperate to know the time, and says, "It has begun." What follows is, of course, the wholesale slaughter of the Narn base by 3 shadow vessels, complete with numerous fighters and a Jaquan-class cruiser that doesn't even manage to undock before it's blown apart. As we've come to expect, the shadows are thorough and clinical. Reefer says there is one more obstacle to be removed on the homeworld, and leaves Londo on the Zocalo, where he is accosted by G'Kar, but not for the reason he thinks. In fact, G'Kar buys him a drink, and toasts both the Emperor's health and his. Londo, of course, is utterly dumbstruck by this, not knowing of the Emperor's message, and having assumed G'Kar had learned of the attack. So there is bitter irony in G'Kar being upbeat about the chances for their races to reconcile one day. In Quadrant 14 space, a group of 4 Centauri cruisers jump in with their supporting fighters. They move through the wreckage of the Narn orbital base as a Narn fighter squadron arrives via the local jump gate. The fighters send word back home as they move to engage the Centauri forces. So the stage is set, the shadow attack looking like a Centauri assault, unlike the Quadrant 37 attack in Chrysalis when there was no such deception. And so it begins. Sheridan and Ivanova learn of the attack as Garibaldi speaks with a mysterious stranger who brings a message from an old friend, Commander Sinclair. The man is a ranger, part of a group gathering on Minbar to combat a coming darkness the Minbari have been preparing for some time. The ranger says they're an army, small but growing. He's been around for a couple of months, watching, listening. Sinclair asks Garibaldi to support them, and tells him to stay close to the Vorlon and watch out for shadows. They move when you're not watching. These revelations are interrupted by a link call to say that G'Kar is rampaging towards Londo's quarters, having learned of the attack and the loss of some 250,000 Narn. He decks security officers left and right until confronted by Sheridan and a squad of officers with PPGs drawn. G'Kar is beside himself, screaming that they will kill everyone. Sheridan says he has to make a choice between revenge and trying to help his people by remaining on board. Finally, G'Kar smashes his fist into the wall and sinks to the floor, sobbing, broken. Sheridan orders him left alone. The Emperor is passing, but Franklin, perhaps, has arranged a visitor for him. He finally fulfills his wish to see a Vorlon and asks Kosh how this will all end. His reply is, in fire. Garibaldi is sharing Ranger intel with Ivanova and Sheridan, but not saying how he's getting it. But it establishes a link between the Shadows and the Centauri, although not to Quadrant 14 directly. Sheridan's rule number 29, always make your opponent think you know more than you actually do. They may have enough to play a bluff on the assumption that the Centauri won't want this information coming out. The Emperor is told of the retaking of Quadrant 14 by Reefer on his deathbed. He pushes him away and motions for Londo to come closer. He whispers to him, then passes. Londo says that he gave the attack his blessing, when in fact he said that he and Reefer were damned. Reefer says it's a small price to pay for immortality. Londo is not comforted by this. Sheridan visits Jakar in his wrecked quarters, telling him he has called a council meeting to try and help. Jakar tells him he will attend as he steps out, and thanks him for stopping him. In the meeting, with Kosh present, Sheridan uses his bluff, saying that Earth observers are going to interview the Narn survivors of Quadrant 14 to establish how the Centauri were able to take the colony so quickly. Sheridan suggests the Earth transports not be interfered with. Where Londo was once talking about retraining, he now says he might be able to persuade his government to send the civilians home as a gesture of goodwill, so observers will not be needed. Bluff played successfully. Then Jakar speaks, having entered in the course of this conversation. The Centauri held the Narn homeworld for 100 years before being driven off, having decimated it. The Narn swore it would never happen again. The destruction of Quadrant 14, their largest civilian colony, is a red line. 2 hours ago, the Narn formally declared war on the Centauri. Jakar says the hope for peace is now lost. They are now at war. The Centauri presidential convoy leaves Babylon 5 as Reefer notes that with the sudden death of the Prime Minister so soon after the Emperor and the neutralisation of other families, the Emperor's nephew now has a clear path to the throne, and he thinks as they do. Amusingly, Reefer tries to hand off his drink to Veer as he speaks, and Veer remains motionless, forcing Reefer to hang on to it while he's holding forth. Reefer says they have Londo to thank for their faction's rise to power, and he will find the new Emperor's gratitude most rewarding. Reefer leaves, Veer noting that he's surprised Londo didn't ask to be given a position in the royal court, which could have set him on a path to become Emperor himself one day. Recalling his dream, he tells Veer he is content to work behind the scenes. It's much less risky. Garibaldi bids his new Ranger acquaintance farewell, but asks for him to share intelligence as the new shooting war progresses. He agrees, in return for their presence being kept secret. Garibaldi asks him one final question. Does anyone else know they're here? One other person, yes. And Delenn is seen inserting a data crystal into a port, with Sinclair once again saying, "Hello, old friend." I realise on getting to this point in the series that I have long held a script book for The Coming of Shadows, yet strangely had never actually read it. Perhaps part of a convention hall back in the day, or something I tripped across in a comic store. I think from its size I had assumed it was purely the script, but actually it contains a very long foreword by J. Michael Straczynski about his hopes for the series as a whole, and his feelings about this episode in particular after it won a Hugo Award, which used to be the basis on which he made some unconventional book borrowing choices in his youth. I dug the book out of my pile of graphic novels where it had landed during my house move, and felt I should work through the foreword to help frame this section of the video. In JMS's words, the show in some ways can be seen to revolve around choice, consequence and responsibility, just as our lives do. In creating Babylon 5 for US television, JMS consciously went against the perceived wisdom that only Trek could do science fiction at the time, and he also rejected the single episode reset approach to episodic television. That's not to say he didn't want happy endings necessarily, but he recognised that the ending was perhaps less important than the journey taken to get there, and therein lies the story. The second season of Babylon 5 takes its name from this episode, with good reason. Hugo Awards are audience awards, and Babylon 5 touched people because I think it is in many respects a mirror, and requires you to accept that sometimes when you look in the mirror, there are questions to be asked that do not have perfect answers or answers that are comfortable. And we all feel that discomfort, that uncertainty at times. In that sense, Babylon 5 is real, even if it is also escapism. I've always felt that science fiction works best when it causes you to reflect on the human condition, to see what happens when we're put in extraordinary circumstances. JMS notes that one person, making one choice, has frequently had far-reaching consequences for the world, and this episode takes that idea and stretches it to galactic proportions. You may have seen a video on this channel that asks the question, why watch Season 1 of Babylon 5? Let's rewind back to the first episode of the first season. The Narn attack a Centauri colony, initially feign ignorance, then say they were invited in, only to have a deception called by Commander Sinclair. Fast forward, and the Shadows attack a Narn colony, the Centauri claim the victory, and have their apparent victory tempered by Captain Sheridan. The tables have been turned and overturned by the arrival of the Shadows. Where Sinclair was presiding over treaty negotiations with G'Kar and the Ascendants, Sheridan is now bluffing Londo into compromise as he ascends at the cost of the outbreak of war. So Londo's choice here costs lives, and unlike Quadrant 37 in Chrysalis, he can't claim ignorance of the power of his allies anymore, and it will cost more lives, given he knew it would mean war. Veer can see the consequences and, in a show of maturity, stands up to Londo and Reefer, up to a point at least. Londo's dream is prophetic, JMS showing us an ending, but not how it is arrived at. The hand reaching out to the stars was described in the geometry of Shadows, as was the foretelling that he would have many victims. He may be Emperor one day, but seemingly a sick, isolated one, destined to die at G'Kar's hands, which was also foretold of far earlier in Season 1. When he says it has begun, it means both the attack and his steps down that dark future path. I see Reefer as the devil on his shoulder here, tempting him to help bring the Empire back to glory by whatever means. So Londo has made his choice, and we await the consequences. G'Kar also makes a choice here, and he begins the episode with a fiery revisiting of his Season 1 anti-Centauri stance. He then achieves a clarity of vision and a calm in choosing to kill the Emperor. That is then upended by Franklin's revelation, when G'Kar realises that the past does not have to be replicated in the future, and the cycle could be broken by an honest apology. That opens up his choices once more. He can roll the die again. So then we have the gut-wrenching scene, where this new G'Kar offers an olive branch to Londo, unaware that Londo's choice has utterly betrayed his hope, and we can see Londo's realisation that he too had other alternatives available had he just listened to what Veer was trying to tell him and resisted Reefer's temptation. So tragically, he simultaneously sees hope as well, but also has already crushed it, and Jurassic plays this scene beautifully. Finally, G'Kar is left crumpled on the floor alone, having chosen his people over his own desire for retribution. Another choice which he thanks Sheridan for forcing him to make after the event. It would have achieved nothing, changed nothing after all. We probably all had to step back at points in this respect if our cooler heads has managed to prevail. I still find it important to vent, which I think is what G'Kar did in thumping the wall rather than Londo's head. The driver for this entire episode is, of course, a choice made by a dying emperor who has recognised that he has the power to make choices of his own, having been steered into his choices during the rest of his life. He chooses to travel and risk his life in the hope that one conversation with a blood enemy could have positive consequences. With a twisting of his passing, the responsibility of that not happening now falls onto Londo. I had forgotten just what a turning point this episode was, and it comes out of the blue in the sense that the previous episode doesn't warm us up for it. I recognised its title and it came back to me quite quickly, but I'd forgotten that we get introduced to the Rangers and saw Sinclair again out of the blue as well. So this is a new element in play, a human on Minbar building a force of Minbari and humans, as I was recently reminded Linear foretold in Points of Departure, to combat the coming darkness. So we now see that there is going to be some counter to the machinations of the Shadows, and they will be allies of the command crew and Delenn. Even if the Shadows have been instrumental in creating a conflict, there is a hope for resistance. Let me note something here that I recall mentioning on the news groups of the day. This is the third time we see Shadow capital ships acting for the Centauri in this series. In Signs and Portents there was 1. In Chrysalis there were 2. Now there are 3. G'Kar has already identified activity out on the rim, and we saw another ship take down a Jaquan cruiser sent to Zahadum. The Shadows are clearly gaining in strength and capability over time, and as with the Quadrant 37 attack in Chrysalis, they make short work of the similar Quadrant 14 outpost and its fighters. For someone like me, who was a long-time fan of spaceships in general, the depiction of the space combat here was great, with the shadows triangulating fire at one point. Having this many ships on screen is not unusual for Babylon 5, but the wholly CGI approach offers them far more flexibility with angles. This is emphasised by the subsequent shots of non-fighters flying up, in inverted commas, towards the Centauri cruisers later in the episode, and the seemingly casual use of CGI to depict a large group of Centauri capital ships, and even the Centauri homeworld and palace. These were radical scene-setting tools being brought to bear very early in TV terms, with incredible skill and a very sensible approach to how the engagements might play out. I'm really crossing my fingers that Eagle Moss / Hero Collector might one day manage to wrangle the rights to produce their model replicas of the ships of Babylon 5. See some of my other videos for examples of their products if you're unfamiliar. I was going to wrap up here, as this will be a long one as it is, but then I saw a little note I'd made during my typing of the synopsis. Did the Emperor's telepaths pick up on Londo's lie? I don't know exactly what they were trained to do beyond observing, but I noticed that they were there when he died and exchanged looks with each other on leaving Medlab. Logically, were they scanning either the Emperor or Londo, they would know that Londo made up the Emperor's last words. Now, they may have opted for discretion, or Reefer's people might have tidied things up after the event. It's pretty late right now, and I want to get this recorded, but I'll do some more research and see if anyone ever asked JMS that question. If they didn't, I might try my hand, and I'll report back if I get a response. So, just shy of halfway through the season, the introduction for this year now begins to come into focus. The Babylon project was supposed to keep the peace, but has now failed. All it can do is try to broker a peace as the shadows continue to move. And no, the next episode isn't the going of shadows. Coming, going, get it? I'm afraid. Settle in, and I'll see you on the next one. Oh, and on the script book front, I may try a little offshoot video that might be interesting, but again, it's something I need to research. So cheers for now.